The colossal, silent carcasses of the Maginot Line fortresses baked in an unseasonably warm May 1940. Deep within Fort Hackenberg, Sector 4, the war felt like a distant rumor. The air was stale, a mix of oil, concrete dust, and cabbage soup from the galley. Soldiers of the 164th Fortress Infantry Regiment, like young Corporal Etienne from Lyon, spent their days in a surreal routine, polishing the breech blocks of 75mm guns that would never fire, playing endless games of belote in the dim light of barracks cut into the rock, and listening to the hum of the underground generators. Their world was one of retractable turrets, electric railways for ammunition, and filtered air, a masterpiece of defensive engineering that bred a dangerous complacency. Officers, pointing at detailed maps, assured them the real attack would come through Belgium, right into the waiting jaws of the Allied mobile forces. The dark, hilly Ardennes to their north? Impenetrable for modern forces, a colonel declared during a briefing, tapping his pointer for emphasis, a death trap for tanks. This belief was their psychological armor, stronger than 3 meters of reinforced concrete above their heads. The first crack in this armor was not a shell, but a sound. It was the distant, unnerving whine of dive bomber engines, growing from a murmur to a piercing shriek. But the explosions that followed echoed not on their own positions, but miles to the west, behind them. Confused reports crackled over the field telephone. Enemy vanguard at Sedan? Impossible. They're crossing the Meuse. Where is our air force? Then a motorcycle courier, white with dust and fear, brought a scrawled note to the command post. The roads to the rear were jammed with civilians, and German spearheads were advancing at a speed no one had imagined. The Stukas that haunted the radio waves were not hitting forts, they were surgically severing communication lines and shattering reserve divisions miles behind the front. The twist of fate was cruel and absolute. The impregnable fortress, the pride of a nation, was not destined to be stormed in a grand siege. It was to be made utterly irrelevant, bypassed and ignored by an enemy who had rewritten the rules of war overnight. The battle they were trained for was already lost. A new kind of hell, built on speed, radio waves, and paralyzing shock, had already begun. At the Meuse River near Sedan, the theory of blitzkrieg became a terrifying reality. The French defenders of the 55th Infantry Division, a second-rate unit with outdated artillery, watched the far bank with growing dread. On May 13th, the sky turned black, not with clouds, but with waves of Junkers U-87 Stukas. They fell from the sky one after another, their infamous Jericho trumpet sirens wailing, unleashing pinpoint bombs on bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts. The bombardment was not designed for mass destruction, but for systematic paralysis. It lasted for hours, a continuous, earth-shattering hammer blow on the nerves. In a command bunker, Captain Lefebvre saw his telephonists freeze, then break, hands clamped over their ears, unable to relay orders. The deep, resonant explosions traveled through the ground into the very bones of the defenders. When German assault pioneers finally pushed off in rubber boats, resistance was sporadic. Key strongpoints fell not to infantry, but to the psychological collapse induced from the air. The line was pierced not by a battering ram, but by a scalpel that severed its spine. Through this gap poured the steel flood of Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps. Their orders were insane by the old standards. Don't look left or right. Don't stop to consolidate. Head west for the Channel coast. For the French army, still thinking in linear terms, this created a surreal and catastrophic situation. Sergeant Pierre's reserve battalion, ordered to counterattack towards the breach, found themselves not facing a front line, but enveloped by a moving tide. While marching down a sun-dappled country lane near Bouvelment, the air began to vibrate.
From a hidden fold in the terrain, a column of Panzer IVs emerged, their gray hulls crashing through hedgerows. The French soldiers, trained for set-piece battles, were caught in the open. There was no time to deploy. The German tanks didn't even fire their main guns. Their commanders stood in the hatches, gesturing with flags, herding the stunned Frenchmen into ditches. Pierre watched as his captain, a veteran of the Great War, simply unbuckled his pistol belt and let it drop into the dust, tears of impotent rage streaking through the grime on his cheeks. In less than 20 minutes, a battalion ceased to exist, captured not after a fight, but neutralized like an irrelevant obstacle on a highway. The trap wasn't a location, it was a state of constant, disorienting motion.
The German breakthrough triggered the largest mass migration in modern European history, the Exode. Over 8 million terrified civilians, convinced the invaders were barbarians, took to the roads. They created a scene from a medieval painting of hell transposed to the 20th century. Peasant carts loaded with mattresses and heirlooms, tangled with sleek Citroëns of the bourgeoisie, their roofs piled with suitcases. Cattle lowed in panic, children wailed, and the air grew thick with the stench of sweat, gasoline, and animal waste. This river of despair became the perfect target. German fighter planes, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, treated the congested roads as training ranges. They would dive from the sun, their machine guns stitching lines of destruction through the stalled traffic. For Madame Thérèse, a school teacher fleeing Lille with her 2 daughters, the war became the sight of the car in front of hers exploding into a fireball and the desperate scramble into a water-filled ditch, holding her children's heads under the murky water as bullets whipped the reeds above. Into this anarchy stumbled what remained of organized French military resistance. Captain Jean Moreau, leading a battery of 75mm guns towed by ancient Latil trucks, found his assigned route to the front utterly blocked by this human tide. His maps were useless. His orders to establish a firing line at a crossroads were a cruel joke. That crossroads was now a 3-mile-long parking lot of despair. The disconnect was total. His soldiers, decent men from Normandy, began to abandon their posts not to flee, but to help, pushing carts, carrying the elderly, sharing their rations with starving children. The military mission evaporated in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe. Moreau's final act of command was not to fire a shot, but to order the guns' breech blocks to be thrown into a river and the ammunition to be hidden in a barn. He then watched, numb, as a spearhead of German PZ KPFW-2s, their reconnaissance half-tracks festooned with grinning soldiers, weaved effortlessly through the stalled chaos. The Germans didn't bother to disarm Moreau's men. They just motioned for them to move the useless truck carcass aside. The road to hell wasn't paved with good intentions. It was paved with the shattered remnants of a society that had ceased to function.
On the morning of June 14th, Paris awoke not to the rumble of guns, but to a silence so profound it was deafening. The government had fled to Bordeaux, declaring the capital an open city. The grand sacrifice to save it from destruction felt, in the moment, like a monumental abdication. The last French troops, a sad rearguard, withdrew south, their boots echoing on empty boulevards. In the courtyard of the police prefecture on the Ile de la Cité, an act of quiet defiance unfolded. Under the supervision of a grim-faced commissioner, clerks burned mountains of files, records on immigrants, political activists, anyone who could be targeted by the new masters. The acrid smoke of the burning archives, the memory of a state, drifted over the sleeping city. Old Monsieur Lavelle, who had fought at Verdun, took his final defiant walk along the Seine. He passed engineers who had laid charges under the bridges, now standing idle, their detonators unused. The order was to preserve, not destroy. The defense of France ended not with a heroic last stand at the city gates, but with the sputter of a single motorcycle carrying a countermanding order, and the smell of bureaucrats burning paper. The first Germans entered not as a conquering horde, but with the cautious precision of men expecting a trap. Around 5:30 a.m., advanced patrols of the 87th Infantry Division, motorcycle sidecars and armored cars edged down the Rue Lafayette. They moved slowly, machine guns sweeping the rooftops of the grand department stores, all shuttered and blind. There were no snipers. The iconic photograph of a German soldier posing before the Eiffel Tower would come later. The first moments were stranger, more intimate. In Montmartre, Madame Clement, the cafe owner who had refused to leave, watched from behind her curtain as a young German lieutenant, his uniform immaculate, knocked politely on the door of the closed boulangerie across the street, as if hoping for a fresh croissant. Finding it locked, he shrugged, then took out a Leica camera and carefully photographed the view down the steep, empty street. The conquest was complete, but it felt absurd, almost banal. The heart of France had not been torn out in battle. It had simply stopped beating. And into that quiet vacuum stepped the new administrators of a terrible, mundane reality.
The occupation quickly shifted from cautious entry to staged triumphalism. While a full-scale parade would come weeks later, the propaganda machine began its work immediately. Small, organized groups of German soldiers were marched to all the iconic sites, the Arc de Triomphe, the Opera, Notre Dame, not to fight, but to be photographed. For the newsreels back home, they posed as tourist conquerors, smiling before the symbols of a culture they now dominated. Lieutenant Ernst, a company clerk with a degree in art history, was assigned to guide a group to the Louvre. The halls were empty, the masterpieces evacuated. Standing before the vacant space where the Mona Lisa had hung, he felt a profound emptiness. The triumph was hollow, a pantomime of victory in a city that offered only cold, silent contempt from behind closed shutters. The real victory had been won in the fields of Flanders. This was its sterile, administrative aftermath, a prize that felt more like a curatorial duty than a military achievement. The ultimate act of calculated humiliation was reserved for a clearing in the forest of Compiègne. Hitler personally ordered the signing of the armistice in the very same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The stage was set with vindictive precision. The car was extracted from a museum. German engineers demolished the wall of the surrounding memorial, and swastika flags were draped everywhere. For General Charles Hunziker, head of the French delegation, it was a walk into a historical trap. Hitler arrived, stood silently before the monument to the 1918 Allied victory, his face a rigid mask of vengeful triumph. Inside the cramped wood-paneled wagon, the atmosphere was glacial. The German terms, read by General Keitel, were a diktat: total occupation of the North and West, disarmament of all French forces, and the handing over of any citizen the Reich demanded. There was no negotiation. As Hunziker, his voice steady but his hand trembling visibly, signed the document at 6:50 p.m. on June 22nd, he was sanctioning not just a ceasefire, but the dissolution of the French Republic and the birth of the collaborationist Vichy state. Outside, German soldiers cheered. Inside, the only sounds were the scratch of pens and the slow, heavy breathing of defeated men. The blitzkrieg was over. The long, gray twilight of occupation had legally begun.
The arithmetic of the catastrophe was numbing. France had suffered approximately 90,000 dead in 6 weeks. But the defining number, the one that would haunt a generation, was 1.8 million. That was the count of French soldiers now prisoners of war. Sergeant Pierre found himself in an endless column trudging east, a speck in a river of faded horizon blue uniforms. For the Third Reich, this was a windfall.
nearly 2 million able-bodied men transformed into slave labor. Meanwhile, the countryside of northern France was littered with the graveyards of materiel. Over 2,000 tanks, 5,000 artillery pieces, and 300,000 trucks, either destroyed or captured intact, enough to equip the entire German army for its next campaigns. The Allies had lost almost all their heavy equipment at Dunkirk and during the retreat. This shocking deficit of armor spawned on the other side of the Channel one of the most curious symbols of desperation, the improvised beaverette armored car. With invasion fear at its peak, the British desperately converted light tank Mk6 chassis by removing the turret and bolting on makeshift steel plates, creating a crude reconnaissance and airfield defense vehicle. This tank-to-truck conversion was a visible proof of the total collapse of Allied material supply and the frantic make-do spirit that followed the disaster in France. The political amputation followed the military one. The armistice line of demarcation, a brutal scar on the map, divided France into two unequal parts. The North and Atlantic coast, all the industrial and strategic wealth, fell under direct German military occupation. The so-called Free Zone in the south, with its government in the resort town of Vichy, was a puppet state from its inception. Marshal Pétain, the aged savior of Verdun, offered the nation a poisonous bargain: collaborate to preserve a shred of sovereignty. For Captain Jean Moreau, now discharged and returning to his home in Rennes, in the occupied zone, this shield was a lie. He witnessed the new reality firsthand: the garish German street signs, the curfew notices, the requisitioning of his cousin's café for officers. The French gendarme who used to know him now averted his eyes. Vichy's authority stopped at the demarcation line. Here, power resided with the Feldkommandantur. The Republic was dead, replaced by a schizophrenic entity, one France occupied and plundered, the other subservient and deluded, both sharing the same profound national shame. And across the water, amidst similarly shattered hopes, British troops trained to defend their coast, relying on the thin steel of beaverettes. A pitiful yet stubborn testament that the war, against all odds, was not over.
In the suffocating atmosphere of defeat, the first acts of resistance were solitary, fragile things. In a cramped Lyon apartment, Jean Cavaliers, a professor of logic, and his small circle of academics operated a primitive duplicator. The stencil for their first leaflet, titled "Not Surrendering," was cut painstakingly by hand. The risk was immense. Possession of such a machine was a death sentence. Their manifesto, distributed at night to mailboxes, argued with cold philosophical precision that the fight for France's soul continued. This intellectual defiance found its emotional counterpart in a voice from London. On June 18th, a largely unknown Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle, speaking from Studio B4 at the BBC, refused to accept the armistice. His appeal was not heard by masses. Few civilians had radios tuned to London, but its text, reprinted by men like Cavaliers, became a sacred text. Quote, "Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not and shall not die," he declared. It was a call not to immediate arms, but to a state of mind: refusal. This refusal took myriad humble forms. It was a railway worker in Tours misdirecting a wagon of aircraft parts bound for Germany. It was a village mayor losing the census records of Jewish residents. It was a housewife, like Simone in Paris, who, when a German officer asked in broken French for the best restaurant, sent him with a sweet smile to the worst estaminet in the city. The first armed groups were not yet the organized maquis. They were soldiers who had escaped the prisoner columns, like Lieutenant Henri, hiding with a few rifles in the forests of the Dordogne. Their actions were tiny, cutting a phone line, slashing the tires of a staff car, painting a cross of Lorraine on a wall. For each who acted, 1,000 watched in silence. But a network of quiet complicity began to form. A landlady asking no questions, a farmer leaving food by a stump. The resistance was not born as an army, it was born as a conspiracy of conscience, a slow realization that if the state had surrendered, the duty of the citizen had not.
The fall of France in 1940 remains the textbook example of how a major power can lose a war before truly understanding it has begun. The roots of the disaster were deep and tangled. Doctrinally, the French High Command, haunted by the Butcher's Bill of 1914-18, worshipped the defensive. The Maginot Line was its cathedral, and the concept of the methodical battle, a slow, artillery-led advance, was its dogma. This stood paralyzed before the German concept of Bewegungskrieg, decentralized, initiative-driven, and prioritizing paralyzing speed over destruction. Technologically, France had good tanks, like the formidable Char B-1 bis, but scattered them as infantry support, while Germany massed its inferior panzers into independent, decisive fists. Politically and morally, the nation was deeply fractured, weary, and led by a gerontocracy riddled with defeatism. The strange defeat, as historian Mark Bloch diagnosed, was a collapse of intellect and spirit at the top, transmitted as paralysis down the chain of command. The ultimate lesson is a warning for the ages. Material strength is meaningless without the intellectual flexibility and moral resolve to wield it. Fortresses are useless if the enemy simply flies or drives around them. A society that prepares only for the last war invites catastrophe in the next. The true cost was measured not just in territory lost or men captured, but in the birth of the Vichy regime, a state founded on the principle of collaboration, a moral surrender that many found more shaming than the military one. Yet from this absolute nadir, a counter-narrative was painfully born. The very completeness of the collapse made the subsequent 4-year struggle of the resistance and Free French not just a military campaign, but a necessary purgatory to reclaim national honor and identity. The catastrophe of 1940 taught the world that no civilization is permanent, that hubris is the prelude to ruin, and that even in the darkest night, the stubborn, lonely choice to resist can be the first step back into the light.